Hello and welcome once again to the Mentionables podcast. The audio you're about to hear is from the Mentionable Conference 2018 and the debate between Tyler Vela and Benjamin Watkins. This is part 2 of the debate. If you didn't catch part 1, feel free to listen to last week's episode of the Mentionable podcast. The argument is on the problem of suffering and evil, and Tyler Vela is saying that God is a sufficient explanation for that problem. Enjoy.
How does that differentiation come? Besides simple presumption of brute fact, because I don't think you would allow that in the reverse.
I do. You have brute fact too. All systems have brute fact.
Right, but you wouldn't allow me to assume the truth of my position as a brute fact. Right?
Yeah, of course I would. That's how we exchange ideas. Like, there's going to be, even if I become a theist, I have to then accept those brute facts that God exists necessarily. He's created for whatever reason he might have created for. Those are just brute facts.
Yeah, well, maybe we're using brute facts differently. I don't think a necessary entity is a brute fact.
I'm just using a brute fact, so those are just the same thing.
Okay, yeah, I think that's...
There's no further explanation
right.
for it. So,
right. Well, a brute fact requires no explanation. I mean, a necessary entity has an explanation. Necessary.
Yeah, but necessary in what sense? A logical, a metaphysical, a factual?
Yes.
So, I mean,
yeah.
there's, it's just saying necessary doesn't solve any problems. You have to, unpack that further. But I'm going to come back to, and still press you, so let's imagine that some child is on fire, and we're the only ones around, and there's a bucket of water. We should pour the water on that child. You would agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
If God doesn't exist, we should still pour the water on that child. Why not?
Well, so what that is you're flipping an internal critique, right? So this is what I was pointing out. So it's changing the question midway through. So I'm going to say, yes, absolutely we should do it, because all people are made in the image of God, and that I have an obligation with respect to being a creature in God.
Why is that child's pain not sufficient reason to throw the water on?
I don't think...
Does it not matter? His pain is not morally relevant, right?
Well, this is where I would come back and I would say, I don't think that is a problem within your worldview, because I don't think any of this would happen if we were in your worldview.
Well,
yeah. So it's hard for me to answer outside of that, because I think that
well, that's what you have to do to try to understand my view.
Right. But I think that question only makes sense within my worldview. We're using...
Well, so then there's nothing I can say to you that's going to make sense. If you're already saying right now, you're not going to be able to make sense of it unless God exists.
Well, no, I'm asking for a way to make sense of it.
I just gave it to you.
Within your worldview. That isn't...
You have a reason to pour the water on the child because the child is in pain.
Okay. Yeah.
That's reason enough. The child's being harmed.
And so the biggest difference I see here, correct me if I'm wrong here, and kind of summing that up, is going back to the original question. Tyler, you would say that God is kind of necessary to ground value, rights, goodness, whereas Ben, you would say that those are just...
irreducibly normative truths.
Yes, exactly, irreducibly normative truths. Okay, all right. So Tyler, I'm going to come to you now. That was great. That's exactly what I was hoping was going to happen, because I asked one question and we went 20 minutes. I love it. And it was meaty.
One more, we're out of time.
It was
trying to go faster.
It was meaty, it was substantive, it was respectful, it was great. You guys clearly disagree. One of the other big disagreements I see is what makes something the best explanation. Would you agree with that? That you guys disagree?
I don't know.
Maybe not.
We agree quite a bit. Now, we might cash it out in different terms, but I think the concepts are relatively the same.
I didn't think in that portion of our explanation that Ben would be like, no, that's not how... My point is just, for his argument to be good, or for his argument to be better than the argument that I have, there are these other metrics that we should use to evaluate the two. I don't think that he would look at it and be like, sucks to explanatory power, like you can take that outside.
That's a great that you bring that up. So I would say that my theoretical accuracy is the same thing as your explanatory power. Those are the same concepts, we just said it in different terms. So, because my theoretical accuracy is how well can the explanation predict or retrodict the data?
Right.
How well does this explain the data? Where I think you would cash explanatory power out in a very similar way.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have more agreement there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we have a lot of agreement.
Yeah, I think we're probably, for most of those standards, I think we're probably in absolute agreement on all of them.
The
Okay.
only one I would push back is the transcendent, but that's because I'm not a presuppositionalist.
Right.
So we would already come into the debate knowing that we disagree on that methodology.
Okay. Let's look at Ben's argument then. The evidential argument from evil. Obviously, the first premise there, at least 10 known facts about suffering. I don't think we're going to have any pushback there. Tyler, when you look at that argument, premise B or premise C there, which one would you take most issue with, and why?
So I would actually back up. So there are some of the facts that I would reject.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Let's talk about that then.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Well, so first, he bases the tetrad, right? He has his four premises that he thinks are conflicting, and some of that leads into it. So
right, real quick, just for the audience benefit, Tyler, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Supernatural, the supernatural agent thesis, the perfect being thesis, and the biblical thesis is what Tyler's talking about there.
No, I think he's talking about the inconsistent tetrad that's at the top of the second page of my handout.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, all right, I got you. Okay. All right.
So I do have other problems with that and the way that that's cashed out with terms of simplicity. But my issue is specifically with point 3, and therefore the conclusion of point 4. Is that the Bible describes God apparently causing, condoning, or commanding undeserved and uncompensated suffering. That to me is the similar argument that I would give to like a Dr. Rowe or Mackey on their probabilistic version, that I think that is a question-begging position. Something is only undeserved or uncompensated. We can only affirm that something is undeserved or uncompensated if we already are of the position that God is not there to have something that's undeserved or have something that's deserved or compensated. All right, so we can only, the only way that we can know something is uncompensated if we already assume that we know all facts of reality, and we know that is not compensated, which Ben is a brilliant guy, but he's not omniscient. So it requires an assumption of the non-existence of God to get this premise, to lead to the argument of the non-existence of God. So I think that the problem with this tetrad is just that it begs the question of the point that it's trying to get to within the premises itself.
What do you think about that, Ben?
So I would agree with you if my premise 3 didn't include the word apparently.
Yeah, well, I would reject that it's apparent. I would say...
So the passages where God has commanded genocide or has people sent to hell for eternity, those don't seem apparent issues of causing, condoning, undeserved, and uncompensated suffering.
Is it undeserved? So the question is it undeserved and
is it
uncompensated?
apparently? So if we were to just make a moral judgment on those, and so this is something all people familiar with these stories in the Bible struggle with. They appear to be morally wrong acts, commanded, or caused, or condoned.
Well, this is where I would go back. So this is what I was saying about the relevant assumptions within all of biblical Christianity. So I'm going to say, once you have the fact that it is God as the ground of all being, the ground, how the Bible understands God as the good, the just, holy, righteous, humanity is sinful.
So now modesty has
has
gone down. You've made more claims.
Well,
to resolve this apparent problem of internal coherence, your hypothesis has gotten more complex.
And that's fine. I'm okay. I don't think that explanation needs to be immodest. Or needs to be...
No, what I'm saying, so to make those moves, to say that, like, look, there might be an apparent contradiction here, but if we add these other auxiliary hypotheses, we can resolve this tension, that comes at a cost. Yeah, so you're relieving the two a priori considerations I had were coherence and modesty. So you're trying to relieve the tension in coherence by creating more tension and modesty. So what have you really, like, the scales haven't actually moved.
Well, I don't think that we necessarily evaluate. So this is why I wanted to bring up more explanatory factors. Because if we have a scale of 2, we weight down one, we lessen one. You're right, they haven't moved.
Well, so
But
you
if we have
mentioned
a
low ad
host
hoc.
of things-
That's part of modesty.
Well, I don't think that it's ad hoc though, because
Why is it not ad hoc? There are auxiliary hypotheses that you're adding.
it would be only ad hoc if I were invented. So it'd be ad hoc if we said, okay, we have these two facts. They're in tension with each other and say, okay, let me now invent a bunch of things to solve that problem.
I would disagree with that.
But-
That's not necessarily, ad hocness is not limited to that. Ad hocness is when more claims are added to the hypothesis. The hypothesis becomes more complex in order to solve the tensions. It doesn't matter if you just invent them on the fly. That's irrelevant.
Well, that would be, I mean, as I would understand ad hocness in the fallacious sense, it is actually altering the thesis to fit the data, rather than saying, okay, well, it'd be like saying,
You're altering the thesis to fit the data by adding those auxiliary.
See, I told you they didn't agree on what was the best explanation. I tried to tell them they didn't agree.
how it's cashed out, maybe. I think that if we say, okay, it's not ad hoc because we have 100 pieces of data already throughout the biblical narrative. We have these 100 pieces of data.
So it's already in modest.
You're pulling out two of them and saying, what about these two? And I'm saying, well,
What about
the
these
two aren't condemning people to hell and
Yeah. Well, this is all apparent instances where we would say it's like God drowning the world in Noah's flood. That's an apparent moral. I don't think that it could be moral for God to perform such an act because it would be disallowed by principle.
But imagine I came to you and said, okay, well, let's talk about irreducible. I'm not good with the science. I'm using this as an example, so forgive me if it falls apart in the details of the science. Let's just say I came to you and I said, look, there are these biologically complex systems. You have a biologically complex system. You have development or design. Natural selection cannot be the only driving force in these kind of things. And you say, well, wait a minute.
Maybe it's not.
In the science, we know that there's natural selection, and we know that there's population selection, and we know there's teleology. And I'm going to say, well, you're increasing your ad hocness. It's like now
That's not part of my hypothesis.
I know. I'm not saying it is, but I'm using this as an example of why that isn't really a problem for me to say. Well, within the entire narrative, right? Because the evolutionists just come back and say, well, with all of the data set of evolution, there's a bunch of information you're just leaving out for why that happens. And I can't go to them and say, well, now you're just making it immodest. You're creating ad hoc solutions.
Well, so making a hypothesis immodest is not necessarily a bad thing if it increases explanatory accuracy.
Right.
Maybe we need Newtonian mechanics is a great example of this. It's simpler than Einstein's theory of relativity, but Einstein's theory of relativity gives us more explanatory power. So that's a way in which
which I think all of that data gives us more explanatory power of what's going on. It does give us
I granted that at the cost. So these are still a priori considerations before we get to explain. You're resolving internal coherence issues by making the hypothesis less modest.
and in this case, I mean, if that's how you're going to define it, I'm okay with that because I think in any sufficiently complex.
So then, how does your hypothesis explain the data better? Then, so it sounds like our disagreement then would come in on the explanatory accuracy.
Yeah, so we have
explanatory power.
Yeah, explanatory power. I think we would get into simplicity. I think we would get into scope issues.
So simplicity, I said, remember, was modesty and coherence.
Right. So this is where I would go back and maybe after this we hit this. Is you give the three examples: the supernatural agent thesis, the perfect being thesis, and the biblical thesis. Right? You're going to say, well, that's a lot of freight to take on.
Well, those are three essential claims that you have to make.
Right. So here's my. This is how I don't understand it. So let's say I came here and I said, okay, well, I pick up the water bottle, and I say, well, what's the explanation for it? Tyler picked up the water bottle. I say, you have three metaphysical claims now. You have you have to have humanity. You have to have maleness, and you have to have the specific person of Tyler. You've now taken on three claims. I think most are to say, well, all you're doing is you're taking one metaphysical claim and you're dividing up three different ways to kind of break off three different attributes to describe it. It's not.
That would make up the concept of Tyler.
Correct.
So keep in mind, these essential claims came when I was building the concept of God.
Right. But I would see it as more of you're going down the funnel. all you're doing is saying, okay, well, how many different ways can we break off descriptions about attributes of what this thing is, right? It's different than me saying, right, so when we talk about simplicity, we're talking about increasing metaphysical explanation. So it's describing me in 3 different attributes is different than saying, well, there was me, and then there was the fairies that are under here and lifting it, and then there's the roof gremlins that have this little hook that come down and they pull that, right? That's the problem we're going to hear. To do that, I'm now unnecessarily increasing metaphysical assumptions to explain what I can do with one thing, right? Explaining the one thing within its, however you can divide up the attributes, I don't think is really all that problematic. I mean, we've seen that I could divide up your understanding of universal cosmic indifference. I could do cosmological explanations, evolutionary explanations, biological explanations, philosophical. I mean, I can multiply the descriptions of your view.
No, so my view is, the only claim I'm making is that sentient life in the cosmos is not the result of malevolent or benevolent actions by a disembodied person. My hypothesis is limited to that claim, and it can only be wrong in one way.
Right. Well, but
yours can be wrong in more than one way, because Islam could be true, pantheism could be true, or deism could be true.
Well,
so this is an easy way to illustrate how your hypothesis is more complex than mine.
Right.
And so my claim in my premises is that my hypothesis is simple.
Right. I'm not sure that it is, though, because your view could be wrong if Christianity is true. Your view could be wrong if
but those would all be the same thing, where there would be a disembodied mind who cares about sentient suffering. Those would all be the same thing.
We could narrowly define any purposes. So I could say, well, there's only one way that Christianity could be false, if any other religious system is true. I mean, I could define it. Well, the only way, there's only one way that this one could be false. Is that as any other religion?
Well, so no, because I just said, so like metaphysical naturalism could be true, Islam could be true, or deism could be true. These are distinct ways that your thesis could be false, in ways that cannot be analogously.
Yeah, I don't follow that, because I think if those are true, and I think we would go to those views and say, well, there's internal contradictions within the concept of Allah, and you have explanatory problems. You literally are multiplying entities.
I would grant all that. This is the concept.
Right.
So you've got more content within your hypothesis. You have more ways that it could be false.
Yeah, I'm not sure. This is where I go back and say, I'm not sure that I have more content, because if I were to push you on the metaphysical assumptions, I really do think yours has specific cosmological views, evolutionary views, that undergird that.
Those would be in addition to my hypothesis is only that the nature of our suffering in this cosmos is not the result of intentional acts by a disembodied person.
Yes.
It's very specific.
But in order to get that concept, again, all I need to do to mirror yours is to describe yours in conceptually relevant different ways, right? So I can include yours. Yours requires biological evolution.
It doesn't.
Sure does.
No, it could have some sort of Taylor. We could have spontaneously come into existence. That is completely compatible with the universal cosmic conditions.
I'm not sure that it would be.
Why is it not?
I think you would still, especially when we're going into your list. I think in order for you to look at some of those, in order to make the suffering argument, you need all species, all animals that live on Earth, 99.8% of God. You need these things to.
Those are the facts about suffering that we agreed on before. These are the facts of suffering in the world now. Our hypotheses are coming in to explain these facts.
Yeah, I
they're not part of our hypotheses.
I still think yours is freighted on those.
So, my hypothesis is even compatible with a watchmaker type God who just creates us and steps back and never interferes. My hypothesis is completely compatible with that. Just a deistic being who doesn't care about us.
We have about three and a half minutes left, so I just want to end kind of with a more general question. You guys have managed here to get a debate together, have this discussion that's been so meaningful and so fruitful. And what would be your advice to people who are watching, people who are here, in their discussions, whether from the atheist perspective or the Christian perspective, of how we can elevate the discussions to this level?
I think I could also speak with you here too and say that take these questions seriously and be respectful. It's not hard, and you can make a lot of really good friends and have really good discussions, explore really interesting questions. That's, and you can pick up from there, but I think you would pretty much agree with that.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And I think what Ben and I intentionally did behind the scenes is, I mean, we exchanged information, we exchanged arguments. The purpose was not to meme or score points against each other. I mean, we both think that these questions are important. We think that it's important to understand each other, because even at the end of the day, I mean, we're probably not done doing the baptismal after this, you know? Maybe for fun. But for fun, yeah. Watch out for the Kraken. But there's a very real sense where at the end of the day, Ben and I still need to rub shoulders in the real world. We still, you know, Ben needs to go and work in cubicles next to Christians. And I need to go and manage different worldviews. I have atheists and Hindus that work. I mean, I have to go and work. We can't just go there and caricature all the people in our lives based on a meme that we saw online. We understand the humanity, the imago Dei of the people that are sitting across from us. One last joke. I was about to be like, human.
At least you conceded it was a jab. I mean, come on.
We need to be respectful and understanding, and whether at the end of the day we get along, you know, hopefully we get along. Whether or not at the end of the day we agree with each other or not. This is one of the ways that I would look at culture and say, I mean, our politics are fractious, our neighborhoods are fractious. We're divided. If Ben and I can come together about the longest, you know, great debate and do it in a respectful, cordial, I'm going to take him out to dinner later tonight. I mean, if we can do something like that, there hopefully is hope for these other realms of discourse as well.
Absolutely. And besides, the most boring conversation is the one where everyone agrees. So,
unless they all agree with me.
All right, can we give them a hand? Well done, guys. I now want to invite Tyler to the podium to make his closing statement.
I can shout. So, what we've heard are two different ideas for how to give the best explanation for suffering in the cosmos. I think at the end of the day, I'm still left unsatisfied, because I'm still left not exactly sure how we would arrive at something like normative beliefs, at something like morality, how we would look around at the world and say, we have gotten to a place where suffering is objectively and really wrong, and I stand in a normative or an obligatory relationship towards ending that suffering, if Ben's view is correct. I'm trying to understand it. At the end of the day, I can stand here and I believe confidently that Ben's view is incorrect. Mostly because I believe that my view is very correct. That's part of it. But also at the same time, and this could be, maybe one of you, a light clicked that it didn't for me, but there's a point where I'm going to come and say, if there's going to be a rival explanation that comes along, it does need to be a better explanation. It does need to have more explanatory power. It does need to have more explanatory scope. It does need to have other simplicity, modesty, accuracy. It does need to have all of those in the maximum amount that it can, in order to rival a view that I already think has transcendental necessity. And for Ben's view, I'm left still at the end of the day saying, well, I don't know what it means for abstractions to give me obligation. I don't know what that, I conceptually just don't even know what that means. And I don't think falling back on it's irreducibly normative, which is a fancy way of saying it's a brute fact, is an explanation. In the same way that we can say it's rooted in the immutable nature of God. It's a concrete object. A concrete object can interact with other concrete objects in a way that abstractions cannot. I can stand in an obligatory relationship to a rightful authority in my Creator. I don't know how I stand in an obligatory relationship to an abstraction. And abstractions that we do not all agree on. If evolution has caused us to arrive at the belief that suffering is bad, that's a big jump to the position that it is metaphysically and morally, normatively bad. Evolution has also arrived at rape, murder, genocide. Sure, we've gotten to a place in our society where we prefer one over the other. But if the universe itself is indifferent, if the guiding force of evolution is indifferent, where does the normativity come from? Where does it arise? What is it grounded in? What is it rooted in? What is the authority that gives us the obligation? I have an answer for that on Christian theism. I just don't think we have an answer, let alone a candidate for it, on non-reductive metrics. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Ben to the podium to make his closing statement.
I want to begin my closing statement by thanking Tyler for inviting me tonight for such a great discussion. It has been my honor to be able to speak here tonight, and I hope I've stimulated much future thinking and continued discussion. Recall that in my opening speech I laid out an argument for the claim that facts about suffering are at least prima facie evidence against biblical theism and for the hypothesis of universal cosmic indifference. The argument is meant to support my main contentions that the God of the Bible does not make good sense about facts about suffering, and that there is a much simpler and more accurate explanation for facts about suffering. So how did Tyler decide to respond to my evidential argument from evil? Tyler boldly claims that my view is untenable, irrational, and unsupportable, and is a flight from conscience. He claims this is the case for at least two reasons. First, Tyler objects that my appeal to simplicity as my only metric for explanation is entirely too myopic and fails to account for numerous other explanatory metrics. Second, Tyler objects that my internal critique must account for all relevant concepts within biblical theism, which he does not believe I can do. Another underlying assumption in much of Tyler's reasoning is one we've already discussed in the Q&A. It's the implicit assumption that my view somehow implies a form of moral nihilism, which is the view that nothing really matters in the sense that we do not have reasons to care about anything for its own sake. I want to take just a few minutes to explain why I believe these two explicit objections and one underlying assumption are misguided. The first is the easiest to dismiss because Tyler is simply mistaken when he objects that I only appeal to simplicity as a metric for explanation. As you can see on your handout, I also appeal to explanatory accuracy. To use the philosophical jargon, my evidential arguments fits within a Bayesian model of inductive inference, which is just a fancy way of saying a mathematically rigorous inductive argument. For those interested further in this, I highly recommend the work of philosopher Paul Draper. Most of the other explanatory virtues that Tyler appealed to are either irrelevant to this debate tonight, like his appeal to greater explanatory scope, even though the scope of today's debate is limited to the facts about suffering, or are already accounted for by modesty, coherence, and accuracy. The second objection also misses its mark, as can be seen on the handout. I agree with Tyler that my critique must account for all relevant concepts within biblical theism in order to succeed or have any force. That's why I included a biblical thesis within the hypothesis of biblical theism. I even give examples of additional content that can fill out the biblical thesis, like that of original sin or a sensus divinitatis. But notice that any additional content we add to this thesis comes at a cost of making biblical theism less modest and raises further potential problems of coherence. appeals to things like original sin or additional mechanisms within the hypothesis that may increase accuracy but risk making the hypothesis less coherent or ad hoc. Recall that low ad hocness is one of the explanatory virtues that Tyler appealed to. So I'll simply turn the tables on Tyler with this first objection. The explanatory virtues he appealed to are either already part of my hypothesis, are irrelevant to the debate at hand, or actually work against his view and not against mine. This is the case with all but the last explanatory virtue that Tyler appealed to, transcendental necessity. That claim is basically that biblical theism must be true to even have this discussion, as God is necessary for things like rationality, morality, and minds. This is a fundamental difference in mine and Tyler's approach to the question before us. My approach is an evidential one, while Tyler's is a presuppositional one. I do not have enough time to go through the differences of these approaches, nor is it within the scope of today's debate. So it will have to suffice for me to merely say that I believe that things like reason, the laws of logic, and basic moral truths are necessary truths, requiring no further explanation outside of themselves, or as Tyler called them tonight, brute. In other words, I do not find Tyler's transcendental argument for God, or tag, convincing, or even a relevant theoretical virtue with regards to my evidential approach. For more on this topic, I highly recommend Ozymandias Ramses II's YouTube channel, as he has some excellent videos and discussions on this topic. Finally, I want to say something about Tyler's assumption that atheism somehow implies moral nihilism. As with the last objection, I do not have time to outline all of my ethical views, as metaethics is a broad and difficult topic. For those familiar with my work on real atheology, moral philosophy, especially metaethics, is a topic I discuss a lot and I find very interesting. But that is not the debate topic tonight, so I'll have to settle for giving the bare basics. I'm what's known in the literature as an ethical non-naturalist. This secular theory is noticeably defended by atheists like Thomas Nagel, Derek Parfit, Shelley Kagan, and even Peter Singer. We believe that normative statements like basic moral truths are objectively true and irreducibly normative, meaning these truths cannot be reduced to non-normative properties like the attitudes or responses of observers. In other words, we cannot reduce nor identify basic moral truths or properties with non-normative things like God's nature, commands, or human wants and desires. To use the philosophical jargon again, basic moral truths are sui generis and necessary, requiring no further explanation outside of themselves. I believe that some things like suffering, happiness, freedom, and love matter in the sense that we have reasons to care about these things for their own sake. This would be the case whether or not God exists. In fact, I believe my view is the only way of making sense of the essential theological claims that God is perfectly good and always worthy of our worship. These are normative statements. Besides failing to argue for his own metaethical view, Tyler does not even mention that his metaethical assumption is highly controversial and something of a minority in the philosophical literature. But that by itself is not a good reason for rejecting it. For example, his view and my view are not the only live options in this metaethical debate. Sharon Street and Christine Korsgaard have put forward a highly original and influential form of anti-realism called ethical constructivism. Peter Railton and Philip Kipcher have defended a rival form of objectivism to mine in the form of ethical naturalism. And Alan Gibbard and Simon Blackburn have defended a middle ground between realism and anti-realism called quasi-realism. So it's far from obvious that we should concede or accept Tyler's implicitly assumed metaethical view that atheism somehow implies moral nihilism without some further argument. For those who are interested in this, I have a real atheology video titled Irreducibly Normative Truths. In that video, I lay out my metaethical beliefs as well as raise objections to theologically based ethics. Additionally, in the exchange I had with Tyler on his podcast, The Free Thinker, we also exchange our thoughts about metaethics. I assure you that neither of us has had the last word on these questions either. They are perennial questions of moral philosophy. In fact, Tyler and I have discussed doing future episodes where we focus solely on these questions, so stay tuned. That's my shameless plug for both of us. So here's how I want to close tonight. I provided everyone a handout tonight because I want you to be able to reflect on what I've said here today. The questions I've asked, the arguments I've given, and the responses Tyler has given. Thank you.
We now move into the Q&A time. I think John is going to be roaming, if you will, with the mic. And originally we were going to go back and forth, but as long as we have a good balance of questions, I think you guys will be okay with just taking the questions as they come.
Sure.
All right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right.
All right. I got one real quick from Facebook. So he's been waiting hopefully about 22 minutes. Hopefully Mikhail Kozenkov. I apologize for possibly not being able to pronounce your name correctly. So this one is probably just directed to Ben, although I'm sure Tyler would probably be welcome to answer as well. The question is, does Ben accept that such abstract concepts as laws of logic and numbers exist necessarily? If yes, does he think that moral values exist necessarily in the same way? If he doesn't, then how have moral values come into existence and what gives them objectivity rather than reducing them to preferences or social conventions? If there is no objectivity to moral values, yet we still should / ought to follow morality because evolution engraved it into us, then is this should / ought objectively binding? If I use my teeth to chew because evolution made it so, yet I am free not to use my teeth because I want to liberate myself from evolutionary limitations, then in the same way I am free to liberate myself from morality that evolution gave me just like my teeth, am I not?
So and please correct me if I get the question wrong. It sounded like, so I do agree that laws in logic or basic logical truths like modus ponens and modus tollens are necessary truths. They're true in all possible worlds. And I would say that basic moral truths and basic normative truths in general are also necessary truths. So I would not try to reduce these sorts of truths to facts about evolution. So the example I believe was teeth. So we could say that evolution has selected for us to use our teeth in a certain way. That's a non-normative claim. So it does not follow from this fact that we should, ought, or must use our teeth in the ways that evolution has selected for us to. Those require normative premises, irreducibly normative premises. And those, I would believe, are necessary truths, and they are objective in the sense that they do not depend, that their truth value does not depend on the attitudes or responses of subjects. I'm sure you want to say something.
Well, actually, I think the question was largely what we had already discussed a little bit, and so is it okay if I ask like a tangential question for you, related, but I'm curious.
Sure.
I'll concede my time for it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think that planning as evolutionary argument against naturalism would have something to say here. For those who are aware, planning comes along and says if evolution is true, it could have selected for delusion to be more beneficial. And so we could have a defeater for the idea that we are, because we are using, or appear to be using our reason, that therefore it's reliable. So how would you respond to someone who says, well, we could appear to have these normative beliefs that are good, but maybe it was actually beneficial for us to be deluded about that, and that's why. Is that just pure solipsism, or?
Well, so I wouldn't say that we have infallible cognitive faculties when it comes to our normative judgments. Perhaps things like our revulsion to things like incest are not veridical moral truths. Maybe that's something that could be morally permissible. I don't know. That's an interesting ethical question. But coming back to Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, I don't think it works for the simple fact that I think that our ability to respond to reasons and to be able to reliably come to normative truths has survival advantage. So like I said earlier, the way that cheetahs were selected for their speed and giraffes were selected for their long necks, humans were selected for their rationality, their ability to respond to reasons in the world or considerations in the world which count in favor of having certain beliefs or performing certain actions or having certain desires.
Do we have a question for Tyler? Or
Tyler or Ben? Ben? Tyler or Ben? Nobody else asked you anything, Tyler. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry about that.
You're stealing the show. So charismatic.
Cool. You're good with that?
Yeah.
We just okay.
Yeah.
All right, just want to make sure. All right, Nick, go ahead.
Before my question, I would say it's got to be kind of interesting for Ben to be up there making his statement. And no, he shared a panel of so many of us, and we're all sitting back there loading our proverbial shotguns out there.
I'm having a blast. Everyone's been wonderful.
And you were saying that your approach makes the best evident case for all the relevant facts of biblical theism and such. And I was thinking, coming at this from a philosophical perspective, I think a historical one better fits my style. If biblical theism has anything to say about the problem of evil, it's based on the resurrection of Jesus and his entering into suffering and coming back. Now, if I have hypothetically an irrefutable case that Jesus Christ did in fact come and rise from the dead, what would that do to your position?
So, I think that's a fantastic question. The first question, I've thought about this question before. What if I found sufficient reason to believe that there was a resurrection event? The next question that I would pose is, was Jesus resurrected by God? And so, could the resurrection of Jesus, in principle, that argument, outweigh the conclusion of an argument from evil? Or does facts about suffering and evil in the world count against us believing that Jesus was, in fact, resurrected by a perfect being? And I don't really know where I fall on that question yet. It's one that I've been toying with because as all good philosophers, I think, should, I ask myself what evidence or considerations would change my mind. I would, if I were going to be convinced that Jesus was resurrected, I think it would be more something along the lines of a religious experience. And so that sort of evidence, being first person to me, would I think could in principle outweigh any objections I have via the problem of evil. And so then I would then try to figure out the best ways to solve the problem of evil and resolve those tensions. It's a very interesting question, and that's where I'm at in my thinking today.
I just keep exponentially adding questions to Ben. No, and as a recommendation for Ben and a statement of adoration for his mind, in my conversations with Ben, what kind of we talked about the difference between him and as a more traditional atheist and kind of new atheist is that Ben is not kind of a stock and trade. Natural explanations are intrinsically and exhaustively always more plausible than supernatural ones. And I find your answer actually, when I was an atheist, I think that would have been mine. That it's hard for me to delineate what logically would make me that, but I'm pretty sure if I had a religious experience, which is actually what happened for me, that would be, as a first person, more compelling. So in that case, what would you say? I keep bringing up other philosophers' arguments. What would you say then to someone like William Lane Craig, where he says, the believer, while it might not be, a good argument for somebody else, could have justification or warrant for their own view based on something like the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit.
So maybe they do. William Rowe, in his famous evidential argument from evil, says things like this, that maybe that the theist could have good reasons to hold their beliefs, and that he calls this friendly atheism. And so I wouldn't make the strong claims that having a theistic belief is irrational. I just wouldn't make that strong of a claim. And maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but William Lane Craig also That's part of his reformed epistemology. He's saying that we can have the belief in God can be properly based, and we can have the witness of the internal witness of the Holy Spirit. Is how he says it. Right?
Yeah, he's not reformed epistemology, but that is one aspect.
It's one aspect. Thanks for the correction. But I think there can be defeaters for properly based beliefs are beliefs like belief in the external world, or belief that there's other minds, or that the past really exists. And we don't have defeaters for those properly basic beliefs. I don't think God is a properly basic belief in that sense, because I think there are defeaters there. But that's a whole other whole other path. But hopefully that answers your question. Like, I think it can be. I think that Christians can be warranted.
It could be a self-warrant, but maybe not a good argument.
And so that's why I think that a religious experience is something that could, in principle, change my mind. Because it would give me that warrant where I go, look, it'd be like the existence of the past or my memory experiences. I'm like, look, this just seems so overwhelmingly to be the case. Yeah, it's possible. And I have to be open to that possibility as a philosopher.
Now you know how to pray for Ben?
What's going on, Ben? You did a fantastic job, man. Both of you guys did. And I've got several questions, but I'm going to try to limit it to just this is one for now. And I've been careful to word it in such a way that I don't jeopardize my ride home, because I'm along with the company.
You'll get a ride home anyway.
Why do atheists eat babies today?
I've only had one baby this week.
One baby. I got a couple. I'm just going to start with this one. So, you said that moral truths are irreducible and necessary, I believe.
Correct. Yes.
Given that ethics isn't simply a rational enterprise, I know you've kind of juxtaposed it with, say, the laws of logic, for example. The laws of logic would be something more descriptive, maybe describe what is the case.
That would be a relevant difference between those domains of English.
Right. What is the case, or what could possibly be the case. But however, with morality, there's both propositional content and prescriptive content, to moral truths. And I'm wondering how, on your view, could it be the case that you have these necessary propositions that are prescribed and yet have no prescriber? And would you agree that it's rational to take the step of positing a prescriber to these moral truths upon which they are contingent?
So, if I were to be a reductionist in ethics, like an ethical naturalist, I would have to admit that basic moral truths could be contingent. But I don't take that route because I'm going to use some philosophical jargon. I accept the supervenience thesis. So I believe that basic moral truths have to be necessary truths, because I don't think it makes sense to say that there's a world identical to ours in all of its non-moral respects, but in which the Holocaust was morally permissible. To me, that just doesn't make sense, and that would be a reductio ad absurdum of that position. And so that's one of the reasons that leads me to the anti-reductionist position. And you're very right to say that logical truths have descriptive elements to it, and some of them are not normative. But I think that in logic, like some rules in logic, are also normative. So, for example, we ought not to contradict ourselves. So I think that truth is both logical and normative. So there is ways in which these domains can overlap. There's not a sharp distinction between them. I used the example earlier between moral truths and non-moral normative truths, where I gave the example of a valid argument with true premises, and that we ought to accept the conclusions of those arguments. I think that would be true in all possible worlds. There's no possible world in which it would not be incumbent on rational agents to, if they believed an argument was valid and they believed it had true premises, it would always be irrational for them to then reject that conclusion. I hope that answers your question.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
And I think Ben is choosing the word normative for a purpose. There's going to be a difference between kind of a pragmatic isn't the right word that I'm looking for, but kind of a practical normativity compared to like a moral normativity, or what we would call like a moral obligation. So those are going to be philosophically distinct concepts.
That's a great point. So I could say I prefer so-and-so, so-and-so, and that's a descriptive statement. But then I could ask, should I do something? And that's where the should, ought, must, better, good, bad, right, wrong. That's where all those terms fit in, is the normative aspect. It's why I believe we had a conversation just the other day with someone else where we were saying why science can't, in principle, answer the normative question. Science can answer the question of whether or not we can extend lives 1,000 years in the future, but it can't answer the question whether or not we should extend lives thousands of years into the future. That's how we can understand the difference between the practical necessity and the irreducibly normative aspect of it.
And I think for my, I'm not going to add a question for you. I think I would go along with the question. I think you might have actually phrased the question better than I did in our discussion, which comes back to, is it reasonable to go that one further step of saying what's the grounding, what's the justification for it? And I think in cases like this, it is, and this is where I'm going to go back to. I don't know what it means for something like that to be a brute fact, and so I want to look for another explanation, right? Because I don't know what that means without an explanation. I think it justifies us saying, well, what is the explanation of those irreducibly normative facts about justice? Well, God is I think the only and best candidate for that, because as a transcendent mind, that I think is going to be the most reasonable candidate, necessary candidate actually. But then when it comes to God, because God is a necessary being, there's an explanation. There's an explanatory factor about God Himself that's a backdrop that stops the question. We don't need to keep going and looking for other explanations, because that's just what it is to be a necessary being. But it's not necessarily what it is to be a brute fact that it's without that foundational explanation. So that is why I agree with you. I think it's reasonable and justified to go that one step further.
So Tyler stops the explanation with God. But before that, he had the irreducible normative truth. He's looking for that further explanation. And so it's not surprising that you come to God. You're looking for that explanation. And so I think that's the mistake, in which he's looking for the further explanation. The reason that he's finding that further explanation is because he's trying to further. I don't think that you can reduce those normative truths to anything further. Commands of God, the nature of God, human wants and desires. I don't think it can reduce these, to use the jargon, these truths are sui generis. They're necessary. They require no further explanation outside of themselves. The order of normative explanation is different on our views. So I explain the rightness and wrongness of actions by appeal to these normative truths, where he explains these normative truths as facts about a subject, the attitudes or responses or demands or nature. So there's an order of normative explanation that's different. And so my order of normative explanation doesn't search for that further explanation.
We have another question?
Go away, boy, you bother me.
When we're talking about transcendental, or let's say metaphysics or metaethics, we're talking about. I'm going to take a concrete, concrete position, a concrete person in history. And we all agree that Jesus Christ walked the face of the earth.
Sure.
We take that concrete person, and then we take the concrete witnesses that were around him, that witnessed what he did, and also wrote it down. So when this concrete person, Jesus Christ, came, he said, I come from the Father, I come from God. So he makes this claim and he makes this statement. So right away he has transcended, out of heaven or out of where this God is. He's transcended and came here. taught, preached, performed miracles, even showed, like power over the waves, nature, power over nature. Nick made a comment about the resurrection of Jesus, but even before we have that, we have people knowing that Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days, that he resurrects Lazarus. And we have concrete witnesses for that. So it seems like he metaphysically transcends doing all these miracles. I know the Enlightenment and logic and reason and Thomas Jefferson just can't accept those miracles. But yet we had witnesses for those miracles, and they happen. So how would you explain Jesus also being wrapped up in this creation thing that we're talking about, that the creation with God? So how would you explain that?
So are you asking, just for clarification, are you asking Ben, how would he explain the miracles and the witnesses of those miracles, or are you asking him how he would explain creation?
Well, how would you explain or refute? Let's say, how would you refute Jesus on that? Because Jesus claimed to come from the Father, who is the Creator, who has done all what we're talking about here today.
How would I refute? So I don't necessarily feel a need to refute it in the sense that I'm comfortable saying I'm not a historian, and maybe I don't know the true explanation of all the facts that surround that narrative. My own beliefs right now are that something like the resurrection, maybe someone stole the body, because I would prefer some sort of explanation like that because it wouldn't conflict with our best philosophical and scientific theories. But that's not decisive.
How about Lazarus?
So again, they could have made some mistake. They could have been under some misapprehension. It could have been some elaborate magic trick. I don't know, and I'm open to the idea that maybe that is true. Maybe that's the route that helps me change my mind. I don't know.
And you're just more agnostic about that at this point.
Well, so I have my own preference of the naturalistic explanations that don't conflict with our best scientific and philosophical. But that's where I find myself today. I admit that's not decisive, and that shouldn't necessarily move someone in the audience to change their minds.
Tyler?
I just say Nick is frothing at the mouth. He's going to attack you after this. Yeah, and I think this comes back to our question last night of what's the authority structure, right? Because I think coming back to even if Ben could come around to, if he could be convinced that it's a reliable account, that still might not gain that the scriptures are an authority for him in that sense. I think especially within the context of the problem of suffering and things like that, I think it wouldn't be incumbent on him to hold to the specific miracles within those claims as well. So.
One more?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So to me, it's not obvious if there's like a baby burning on fire that I'm supposed to put a bucket of water on it. But you're saying you just accept that a priori, like there's no utilitarian ethical framework of like maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain? Is that not a part of that?
So that's the difference between a meta-ethical question and a normative question. So I would say that the meta-ethical aspect of the question is that the child's pain gives us sufficient reason. That's reason enough to pour the water on it. Now, can we justify that action in a normative theory? Perhaps in a consequentialist or utilitarian framework, we would be trying to maximize pleasure or happiness and minimizing pain and suffering. And that might be the reason that fact gives us, or our overriding moral reason why we should do it, or not pouring the water on the child might be disallowed by a principle no one can reasonably reject. That would be a contractualist approach to it. So there's, again, moral philosophy is a quite intricate and difficult topic for reasons like that.
Yeah, I think you stop agreeing. I think we could do the same thing on biblical Christianity, right? So I might say, well, the fact that I observe the child burning innately gives me the obligation to help him, right? But then we could ask the further question of, well, why do I have the obligation? Like, what makes that act intrinsically better? Well, then we're going to get into discussion. So is it as a Christian, I'm going to say, well, it's a modern day, it's innately valuable, I have obligations that like. So you can go into further questions of kind of applied ethics of how those are explained above and beyond just the intrinsic fact that it is morally incumbent upon me to help the child because the child is suffering, and there's something innately wrong about that. Asking why it's innately wrong is kind of a different question.
It's a meta-ethical question. We agree.
We have time for one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just have 5 questions.
Now you're not getting it right.
I just wrote a short paper I'd like to read and you respond to.
It's 20-page paper. So the argument that you made from suffering, is the inductive version of that argument, which I want to say to your credit too, because I think it attests to you're familiar with the literature going that route rather than the
one of the best versions of it.
Right, certainly. So I say that to your credit. Now, I mean, with it being inductive, obviously you're taking into consideration specific events in the world, which we're calling suffering, and then you're generalizing that to some larger truth about the world, God, so on and so forth. Now, induction, by its very nature, it can help us to understand what is happening, what probably will happen, but I struggle to see how it can tell us, what ought to happen. And so, from an atheist perspective, it seems to me that what you've called suffering in your argument would be better construed as, common and even probable, as you've argued, events that are undesirable states of affairs, So if suffering is just stuff that kind of goes against our desires, and those desires, just by their very nature, are subjective, how do you bridge the gap between our subjective personal psychology about events and some real moral truth about suffering, which it seems you would need to make your argument really have weight?
So when I say that suffering is undesirable, I'm not talking about, the object of that claim is not our sentiments. I'm saying that suffering is the object of it, and it is intrinsically undesirable or intrinsically bad. Or suffering gives us all reasons to care about it for its own sake. So we're responding to those reasons. So my sentiments may be that I don't care about suffering, and I choose not to respond to those reasons that facts about suffering give us. And that's when I would say I would be making some mistake at that point. My attitudes and responses to facts in the world would not align with the normative facts. So that's how I bridge maybe the is-ought gap that Hume thinks. I think that we have to have this category of normative facts that are separate from the descriptive facts about our preferences and attitudes and sentiments.
So undesirable in the sense that any moral agent with a properly working rationality would not desire suffering because it has that attribute. Yeah.
It's a property of suffering is probably the better way of saying it. It's a property of suffering that it gives us reason to respond to it in negative ways.
Yeah, and again, this is without going. This is just again where we're gonna diverge, because then I'm gonna say, what makes it undesirable? Like where does that valuative, obligatory part of it come from? And then that's where we're gonna go back and forth on what we already covered.
Yep.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So, as a philosopher, Ben, I know you probably feel that definitions are important, and I would say that definitions of irreducible truths are especially important. So, I'm curious what it means when you put love is good as an irreducible truth. So how would you define love?
So, are you asking for a definition of love or a definition for how? So, love is just the common experience that we have with someone that we have affection for and the relationship that builds for it. And I think those are the intrinsically good-making properties of love. And so, when I say that love is good, what I'm saying is that the very nature of love itself gives us reasons. It's a consideration which counts in favor of responding to these things in positive ways, like wanting them for their own sake. So a loving relationship is its own reward. It's not something that I would do to get something else. It's intrinsically good. And so that would be part of the nature of love.
I think you have a little bit of a disagreement in definitions there, probably with the typical Christian view of love. There's an example like in John 15:13 that says, greater love has no end than this, that he would lay down his life for his friend. And that definition of love, I believe, entails a sense of taking on suffering for the good of others. And I'm sure there's much about love in the Bible, more than that. But I think we might be talking about different things when we say that love is good.
Perhaps, and I certainly wouldn't say that the definition I gave is in any way exhaustive. It's quite the philosophical task to define what is love. And so that was my little soundbite answer to it. But maybe we're dealing with a different concept of love, because part of my concept of love would have the property of being intrinsically good, in the sense that the nature of love gave us reasons. That might be where we disagree.
Yeah, I think, and I would actually add a little bit of clarification for what you're saying is, what you're getting at is a specific loving act, right? So I don't know if we can define love qua love as sacrificial, like giving up your life for someone else. That would be an expression of whatever our concept of love is. I think there's a much better example in Scripture in 1 John that God is love. And so when we want to define love, whatever that means, and for biblical Christianity, we're going to come and say, whatever it means to be loving, whatever these individual expressions of love are, they are reflections of the loving, grounded nature of God himself. And so God would be the nature of love, and that's expressed in ways like we would see in the death of Christ for those that he set his affections on. That could be expressed in other ways that are shown.
That's very good. I think that is a way our concept.
I think love is actually probably a very, very hard concept to define, specifically because sometimes love is expressed explicitly in I don't want to say detrimental ways, but in ways that are brought through punishment or justice, or there could be these other avenues where love is expressed in ways that might not seek the good directly of one individual, but might seek love expressions in other ways. That's where I think some of the tension would rise in the examples that Providence talked.
One of the divine attributes that I tried to unpack was perfect love. And instead of giving an explicit definition for that, I tried to use an analogy to help explain this concept with a perfectly loving parent, and how a perfectly loving parent would react and act with her child, the relation between there. I would say that the relationship between a perfectly loving God and its creation would be similar to our concept of a perfectly loving parent and her child. And that would be the best way I could describe it without giving,
And this is actually where, depending on your theological traditions, I wouldn't accept that definition.
Yeah.
Because I don't think God stands in the same relationship to kind of creation generally as he does to the elect as a Calvinist. So there's going to be qualifications in there that I think that I would want to see much more clarification on, because I'm not sure that definition would necessarily jive with
with what we observe in Christianity. So I said God's love for finite creatures would be infinite, inexhaustible, and unsurpassable. Such love would involve universal benevolence towards and universal care for the well-being of finite creatures, including non-human animals.
Okay. Anyone else?
Okay. I had one more, but we'll leave it alone. So,
I get to ride in the car with you.
I know.
Jeez.
Save something for the guys, dude.
Yeah, I know.
All right, well, you want to close it out, John?
Actually, Joel needs to come up.
Joel with his bags of fun.
Bags of tricks.
We're going to do something really fun for a moment. We're going to do a prize giveaway. Everybody stand up.
Does that include us?
It does not.
Not now that you ask.
All right, does anybody not want to be standing right now? All right, you can go ahead and sit down. That's fine. All right, does anybody not want to win a prize? Okay. All right, so everybody's in the right place. All right, did anybody know there was a royal wedding today? Okay. Anybody that didn't raise their hand may sit down.
Did anybody care?
Totally different question. All right, let's see what I got. Anybody purchase something at the book table?
Go, I say go away, boy, you bother me.
What does kind of mean?
Kind of.
All right, we only have 4 to go. Apparently, only one person didn't purchase something at the book table.
We got it wrong. And only one person should have said
Yeah, there's question of clarification. Do you want the people who bought something to sit down?
I wanted them to raise their hand.
Okay, if you have not bought anything, stay standing.
I'm sorry, I'm confused. Yes, if you have not purchased anything. All right, would anybody ever read a book if they had to? All right. Well, the ones who didn't raise their hands may sit. All right, so the people we have standing will read books, correct? All right. Let's see. Anybody who doesn't affirm the virgin birth? You may sit. All right, let's see. All right, who thinks there was a decisive victor in the debate today? No? No? Just like, okay, that's fine.
Either equally bad or equally well.
Yes.
Anybody drive more than 100 miles to get here? All right, you may sit. All right, anybody never heard of the Mentionables before the conference? All right. Did everybody understand exactly what was being said during the debate?
Dang it, nobody. I think we did words.
Anybody want to ask a question but then didn't?
Hey!
You two may stay standing. Everyone else sit down.
Surprise questions.
All right.
Pop quiz.
All right, I saw 2 hands about the wanting to ask questions, but didn't. All right, so I'm going to choose between the. All right, Marvel and DC.
I mean, I would say DC just because Marvel seems more popular.
All right, DC. This is your prize bag. Show you what you got. You are receiving. Want that?
All right.
The Mentionables Project. This was a book in which a number of us answered 40 questions asked by an atheist. There's 5 answers per question, 1 from each of the mentionables. So you have your choice of which question you like. I'm sorry, which answer you like for the question. And this was our signature project. It's the one writing project we've all done together. This was a pseudo-signature project. This is the children's book version of that. It's like 5 questions asked by kids about God, which are very challenging questions. Only 2 mentionables worked on this book. And then you're receiving my book, Christ-Centered Apologetics. It's essentially an argument for Christ as the Messiah and as God incarnate. And it makes the argument that Christianity stands or falls on this one apologetic argument. So if you need to know one apologetic, it would be the apologetic for Christ. And then it gives that. And then you'll be getting the study guide to that book, because the book started as a course that I taught on that. So the study guide would allow you to use the book in order to teach the course. All right. You will be receiving the same essential prize package, except instead of my book, you'll be getting Tyler's book, which I talked about last night. Tyler's book is a response to David McAfee's book Against Christianity, in which he raises a number of points against Christianity, and Tyler goes down the list and knocks them all down. You don't have to have read McAfee's book in order to understand Tyler's, because he lays out the arguments and then responds to them. So, those are the prize packages. You may come and get them.
Yay! Applause is necessary, yes. All right, we're going to go ahead and break for lunch.
Thanks as always for listening to the Mentionable podcast. Stay tuned to next week's episode for more audio from the Mentionables Conference 2018. Thank you for listening.